I'm Paul Van Riper, a Marine. I retired from active duty in 1997 after 41 years of service. In the years in retirement, I've done a lot of work with both industry and the American Defense Establishment. Also taught at Marine Corps University during that period. In the early 2000s, I was working with the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC. In 2004, Brigadier General Shimon Neve from the Israeli Defense Force came to an exercise that TRADOC was conducting. And during that exercise, he gave us a brief on his idea of systemic operational design. I must admit, it was a little difficult for me to follow, but along with a number of other Marine and Army officers, we saw something in it that just made a lot of sense. I was fortunate then, several months later, to go to Tel Aviv and to go through a week-long course with General Neve. At the end of the course, I had a better handle on it, but I knew I still needed to study some more. What happened is doctrine writers in all the services in the joint community are wedded to a systematic approach. In the Marine Corps, it's called the Marine Corps planning process, and the other services generally referred to as the military decision-making process. It's an analytical process that looks to optimization of various courses of action. At the end, it produces a product based on that analysis. The problem was design involves discourse with those who have some insight to what the problem might be. And it's in that discourse that the logic of the problem should become apparent if the discourse is rich enough and extensive enough. And when you understand the logic of the problem, then a solution emerges naturally. And in my experience, that's what happened when it's done properly. Let me begin with what I think decision-making entails. There are no problems per se. There are only situations in this world. Someone in a position of authority decides they don't like a particular situation and they want to change it. Then the question becomes, how do you go about doing that? What any design team needs to understand at the beginning, what is the problem that that person in authority sees? You need to understand the problem before you can solve it. The tendency is to want to get into some sort of a process before you understand the problem. When I see what we call operational planning teams, I tell them the first thing you do is not look for centers of gravity or some other, at that point, useless step or idea, but stand back and say to yourself, what is the problem and how do we go about approaching it? I had the opportunity with the U.S. Army Research Institute to do a study on what sort of an education strategic thinkers need. And I came up with several. One is they clearly need to have a good understanding of history, of cultures and regions which they might operate in. In my view, American leaders are too often shy on any sort of a cultural understanding of areas that our military might work in. Equally important, they have to understand nonlinear dynamics. By that I mean the nonlinear nature of the world. We Americans tend to want to think and make decisions as engineers. We need to think more like biologists or zoologists and think about open systems because the world and the situations we face are not closed systems that allow themselves analytical solutions. In addition, they have to have a good handle on geostrategy and geopolitics. Particularly the geostrategy is something we haven't taught in recent years. There's been a real movement in the U.S. to talk about critical thinking. Many times critical thinking turns down to analytical thinking, but I do believe we need to have education in how to think critically. And that's, again, not the default to some sort of analysis, but to approach approach the world, approach problems with an open mind and a more all-encompassing. And there's something to be said about a liberal education. We need skills, but we need people who have wider education. In the Marine Corps, we talk about three types of planning, and most organizations recognize this. That is, at the front end, you have conceptual planning, followed by functional planning, and then detailed planning. In America, and particularly American military, we're good at detailed planning. We're good at functional planning, and we have a lot of tools that support that. Our problem is we take those tools and pull them back into the conceptual planning where they don't belong. Conceptual planning is where you do the deep thinking. It doesn't need tools. It doesn't need procedures, step by step. So you have to go forward with that. The question that came up during the Training and Doctrine Command's experimentation with design was, how do you turn a rich discussion in which you've explored the situation multiple different ways and come up with at least a rough idea of what you want to do? I would say a concept of operations. What's next? It wasn't a mystery to me. To bring that concept of operation to fruition, you have to assign subordinates tasks. And once you are able to assign tasks, then you have the beginning of a mission statement. And of course, that mission statement would be the task with an associated purpose or intent. And the mission statement then begins to drive the planning and the execution. So bottom line, design is not separate from planning. Design is just the beginning of planning conceptually. So if you get into logistics, there's a place for optimization. In logistics, you can optimize between various approaches to getting supplies and ammunition forward. When you talk about functional, and there I mean you're talking about intelligence, logistics, command and control, maneuver and fires. There is some analysis there, particularly when you're talking about things like fires or again logistics. I have no problem with the with using systems in approach in those cases. It's the problem is drawing these tools back into the conceptual. When you want your mind to work, you don't want to go through steps. Einstein's reported to have said that if he had an hour to save the world, there was some problem that was going to destroy the world, he would spend 59 minutes thinking about it and 1 minute taking action. I'm not sure that's the right breakdown, but it gives an indication that the thinking is the most important part of planning. Well, I thank all of those who took the time today to listen, watch the thoughts I have. As I look to the future, I would urge you to do two things. One, as I indicated in my talk, cast your net widely, look about and study, but also keep your priorities straight. Remember, first and foremost, keep your faith in front of you, followed by your family and your friends. Then look to your nation, your country, your loyalty to it, and finally, the profession of arms in whatever service you are in.